All right, are we okay to come back? Hello. Hello. You guys good? Good. I really enjoyed hearing all the dialogue of the murmurs from up here, and I felt some of the excitement, and I think you were talking about the questions, but maybe not. But either way, that you're at least engaging, which is exciting. So, the purpose of these questions was to start us thinking about these topics, but also acknowledge, how far you've come, how far behavior analysis has come just in the past year, and also to hear what other people are doing and get inspired by the steps they're taking, so maybe you want to take some of these same steps in your practice. Does anyone want to share their answer? There's also nothing like seeing a typo on the big screen, right? Like 3 of them in front of you, so there's really only 3 questions, but does anyone want to share what they talked about? Sure, go ahead. Yeah, great point. Anyone else want to share? Sure.
We kind of got talking after the last question about how part of the responsibility of making the future generations culturally sensitive is on us by incorporating things that are culturally diverse in our stimuli, our programming, and I think that's something that I personally have been more cognizant of in the past year than ever before. And I think that's kind of a cool responsibility that we have to be able to help our clients and the kids that we work with be more culturally sensitive.
Yeah, it's a great point. Right. Thanks for sharing. Of course, you can't have a talk about culture and diversity in ABA without citing Skinner. So here's your Skinner quotation for the presentation. So let's look at the demographics around the 1900s. And the 1900s is really when ABA was starting to boom. We have a nice picture up here, I think, is representative of the population for the most part. So 88.4% of the population were white, 10.9% were African American, 0.3% were Indian, 0.1% were Chinese, 0.2% were Japanese, and 0.1% other. So when we're thinking about Skinner and some of the things that he was talking about, this is where he's coming from. This is the culture and the time period that they lived in, which is very different from today, and even different from 1998 when the BACB was established. Around that time period in 1997, 82.6% of the population identified as white, 12.2% were African American, 0.8% were American Indian, 3.75% were Asian. And in those 78 years, you can see the change in the demographics of the United States population. And if we even fast forward more, we're seeing even more of a decrease more recently in our demographics, where 76.5% of the population identified as white. So when we're going in and we're using these principles and interventions, we have to think about where were they coming from. I often get asked, why did I choose to talk about culture and diversity? And a big reason was because I'm going into urban low SES schools working primarily with African Americans, and I just didn't have tools and have the resources to implement things like how Cooper talked about them. And Cooper did a great job, but it was hard for me to translate. So with this changing demographics, it's important for us to educate ourselves about how to be effective practitioners and serve an increasingly diverse group. The BACB also recently released their demographics, and you can see them up here with the populations. Still majority white, but I'd say about a third represent minorities. Gender, predominantly female, which is very different from the demographics we saw in the 1900s, where primarily a female-dominated field. So in 2015, I sent out a survey to BACB certificants. So this is about 6 years old. But here's how the respondents reported how they identify. So when we're thinking about this and the majority of respondents, what biases do you think could be present in your practice or in their practice of this made-up fictional person? lot of white Christian people. So like, I mean, and you don't have the answers, but like, so what biases are going to be present with that? Given that you're, this person is primarily going to be white with a master's degree, so they have a little bit more education than maybe the typical person, middle SES, and Christian, how does that impact your practice? All of the biases? Right. I mean, there's definitely biases present. I've worked with families that aren't Christian, and I have to educate myself about the practices going to that home. My family is Asian, and we take off our shoes before we go into the house. That's a practice that if you haven't worked with some Asian populations, you may not be familiar with. Middle SES, I'm coming from with a certain amount of privilege of being middle class myself, and working with low SES students, I have to kind of check at the door and remind myself that they're not going to have the resources that I have. They don't have the same opportunities that I have, and, be sensitive to that. So we just talked about the survey that I sent out, and something important or interesting to note is that the majority of the respondents reported spending less than 10% of their time working outside of their culture. The second highest among the time spent working outside the respondents' culture was 41 to 60%. The largest number of respondents indicated they'd spent 41 to 60% of the time working with someone of a different race or ethnicity. Most respondents viewed themselves as mostly competent or somewhat competent, which is interesting because at the time, the majority of respondents also reported to receiving less than 5 hours of further training via webinars, seminars, workshops, etc., in cultural training or education since receiving their degree. The second largest and third largest number of respondents reported receiving at least 1 year experience working with a culturally diverse population, and no cultural education or training since receiving their degree. These results are interesting as to how are respondents classifying themselves as culturally competent when we still don't have standards, when we still don't have established practices for culturally sensitive behavior analysis, no definition of behavior analysis about culturally sensitive practice behavior analysis should look like. So we want to think about what determines culture. Some of these variables are self-report, or the individual's view or determination, values, what a person considers important to them, such as being an individual, might be more important than conforming to a group. Norms and ideologies, what a person considers important and the normal way to behave. Values for children, so desirable values that they want for their kids, or the parents want for their kids. Beliefs, which are agreements or disagreements with worldview. Behavioral intervention, what people would do in a certain circumstance. Self-reported behaviors or statements, which may or may not reflect the behavior of the self-reporter, such as, I am honest. And attitudes, what people like or dislike as the type of people one would like to have it as a neighbor or an in-law. So we think about why culture matters, and there's a lot of reasons. A big reason is that there's a lot of mistrust among minorities, and this serves as a treatment barrier. So they don't want to get treatment or services from us because they don't think that we'll understand where they're coming from, given that we're from a different culture. And we are biased. We all know we're biased, or hopefully you all know that you're biased and bias exists. And that's important to recognize because it might come across through microaggressions or through our behaviors, and we may not even be aware of that. Culture also affects concepts of illness and diagnosis, which can lead to how old are the clients that we're seeing when they're getting diagnosed, and what services have they had access to. Parenting practice and beliefs often relate to culture, so I have to think about my parenting practices as who I am are going to be very different oftentimes than the families that I'm working with. And I can't let my own parenting practices impact how I want their parenting or what I want their parenting to look like. We also know that cultural competence has national attention in psychology, counseling, and healthcare, and that racial and ethnic disparities in the U.S. have been described in literature. And as has been previously mentioned, we've really failed to address this as a field. So why should behavior analysts care about culture? Effective ABA services depend on the therapist's ability to decipher the relationship between a target behavior and its environmental function, or the ability to carry out and interpret functional analysis, and to be able to effectively communicate with the clients around shared goals, procedures, and outcome assessments. However, when there's a cultural difference between therapists and clients, the difference and lack of knowledge about a culture can interfere with this process. Therapists and clients can misinterpret each other's behavior, and communication can be frustrated by differing expectations. While this presentation is not going to exclusively focus on race, it is important to mention systemic racism as it relates to the topic at hand. Systemic racism exists in many segments of the United States of America. It's woven into our organizations, systems, and history. And ABA, just like many other fields, is not exempt from the cause of systemic racism. Since the 1600s, minority populations have been the victim of systemic racism, leading to oppression. The white American majority promoted stereotypes, ideologies, images, narratives, and emotions which depicted minorities in a negative light. The public health disparities stem from systemic racism, which minorities have experienced. Often, systemic racism is not as overt as individual racism, and it's harder to pinpoint one source of the problem. To put racism into perspective, roughly 85% of the U.S. has included genocide, slavery, and legal segregation. There have been roughly 20 generations of socioeconomic resources being passed down through white generations, which were obtained from racial oppression, such as genocide, slavery, and legal segregation. Due to these experiences, minorities have often experienced economic impoverishment, discrimination, and oppression. Even today, minorities experience poorer jobs, quality of education, less healthy neighborhoods, poor quality of healthcare, and less political power. White Americans have been dependent on black labor for centuries, which in turn leads to increased wealth, privilege, social status for whites. Not only have whites benefited from the oppression of blacks, but being white also ensured superiority, greater economic, political, and social security in America's society. Historically, whites have been believed to be more talented, able, and hardworking, unrelated to the power and privilege they have experienced. The concept of white racial frame helps people make sense of their life via a pro-white lens, where whites are viewed as superior to blacks and other minorities. White power is justified through race-based stereotypes, prejudice, narratives, images, emotions, and ideologies. The superiority of whites, in sum, is unjust and at the expense of minorities' oppression and subordination. There's also been an unjust creation of hierarchical systems of American oppression, which placed white males at the top and other races down below them. Not only are blacks placed lower in the hierarchy than whites, but females are also placed in a lower position. One example of this relates to unfair wages, where black men have been historically paid less than their white counterparts. The lower wage of the black male does not only make them feel inferior, but it also took away many opportunities for advancement. The system of injustice and inequality in America, where privilege is passed down through generations via networks, institutions, and communities, has become ingrained in society. Due to that fact, it's also often difficult to understand the intangible and tangible benefits and advantages that a white person has obtained. There have been significant differences in the narratives of blacks and whites on views with slavery, legal segregation, and contemporary racial realities. It's important to understand the difference in these narratives and the cost to black Americans. We need to take critical reflection and action across race relationships, examine our biased laws, policies, and practices. In ABA, systemic racism has impacted the way in ways such as who has access to ABA, education, representation, and more. Tokenism, I'm sure you've all heard this topic or this conversation before, is something many ethnic minorities deal with, and it's a perception of how others believe that a scarce representation speaks for an entire race of people. As a form of tokenism, this perception overwhelms ethnic minorities to be disproportionately called to mentor, supervise, and facilitate the majority of organizational initiatives with multicultural underpinnings. This is definitely occurring, and it actually doesn't help to promote diversity. In fact, it's lonely. Being the only one, or one of a few people who share your identity, can be isolating. You might not have someone to turn to for support or validations when microaggressions or aggressions occur. If you find yourself in a token situation, it's important to find mentors and supportive communities outside of your organizations if you don't have any inside of it. This is an important point because we know ABA isn't the most diverse field. We just saw the slides. So you might have to go outside of ABA to find a mentor that you can connect with. And if you're a token, you can feel invisible. If your achievements go acknowledged, your contributions ignored. You might also get a sense that people in the organization don't really know you as an individual, and you're just representing your identity, like race or gender. Imposter syndrome is the belief that one's accomplishments are not due to their own capacity, such as a skill or intellect, but rather external factors such as luck, effort, receiving help from others. They see themselves as a fraud and are scared that someone's going to find out about their talent or lack of talent or phoniness. And guess who this affects most? Anyone want to guess? Minorities. Women. BIPOC, women, women of color, especially African American women, and those in the LGBTQIA+ communities who this affects. And you see unequal representation and a lack of role models that perpetuates this. Racism, sexism sends messages, and growing up with these impacts how we see ourselves. It makes people feel like they don't belong, and they don't have any guidance on how to manage stereotyping, stigma, and oppression. I can't tell you how stressed I was before coming here. I still am, partly because I'm sharing personal information about things that I've experienced, but because I feel like an imposter half the time. I feel like I'm questioning myself, why am I here? What do I have to offer? And I'm floored when people come and hear me talk. So to tell you a little about my personal experience, I'm adopted, so my parents are white, which I think also impacted why I was interested in studying culture. They also exposed me to working with diverse populations. I spent a lot of time volunteering when I was young, so I'd be exposed to people other than myself, and looking back, I really appreciate that. So when I was practicing more as a BCBA, I had clients request that I not be used because they assumed that I would have an accent. So my maiden name was Hughes, and then I changed it to Fong. And actually someone in academia told me I should really consider hyphenating my name because I would sound more white and get more publications and more presenting engagements. I've had faculty in my higher education ask me in a public forum if English was my first language, which I can't tell you how humiliating that is. I've had other faculty discriminate against those with foreign names, which was discovered because a complaint was made, maybe or maybe not by me, where they looked at these grading practices and they found out that people with foreign names were being graded lower. And this person got away with it. They were still faculty when I left. I've been told to put my big girl pants on when collaborating with other BCBAs. And when I submitted my first article, the Multicultural Standards for Behavior Analysis, I had no idea what I was doing. I actually thought an editor goes through and edits your paper, so I submitted it with typos and incomplete sentences. And part of this was because, even though I grew up in a middle-class white society, I didn't have mentors in my field who looked like me that I felt I could really talk to. I also went to an online education for most of my higher education, and at that time, there wasn't a lot of community, so there wasn't a lot of opportunities for mentorship. And what I'm hearing now at these conferences is that people are making more of an effort. Students are being advocates for themselves and forming groups, which I think is fantastic because you're supporting each other and you're giving yourselves a lot of opportunities that people like me didn't give themselves. I often feel anxious, not only about COVID recently, but anti-Asian hate. I get concerned with going out in public places. Just last week, I went to a restaurant with my friend, who's also a minority, and was yelled at, "No masks in here, this is America," which, as you can imagine, makes me feel very sensitive about wearing a mask now in public, and that shouldn't be the case. All of these experiences are things that a mentor can help a mentee with, and more. There are so many experiences that minorities go through that are often not talked about for a variety of reasons. That should be examined and talked about. And mentorship might be one platform to allow these experiences not to be swept under the rug, just like there are so many times. In thinking about systemic racism, tokenism, and imposter syndrome, it's clear that people might be struggling, and we may have no idea. But we need to think about why how we can find out about their battles, or why we don't know. Are we not listening? Are we not aware? Do we not ask? A question I've heard a lot during this past year or two is a well-intended one and coming from a good place. The question starts with, what can I do as, and is generally followed up by a white person. And for some reason, this question surprises me, because maybe it only focuses on race. As clinicians, I often went to see clients and had similar questions about what can I do as, but it was, what can I do as a neurotypical person? What can I do as a middle-class person? What can I do as a Catholic, as a person coming from a two-person family, as a person with or without a child? And I think these thoughts help me to remain humble. I've never come in as the expert, which maybe relates to the imposter syndrome, and I think sometimes as BCBAs and clinicians we do. We need to keep an open mind and ear. I think we need to expand our vision outside of just race, because when it comes to diversity, there's so much more, and there's always something that you can do. My colleague, Dr. Chris Rosado, and another student at Pepperdine, Lisa Aureliano, set out a survey asking behavior analysts about their education, training, and knowledge about some LGBTQIA+ areas. Note the survey's still open, so feel free to take it. But We ask questions such as, how familiar are you with the gender affirmative model? And these are the responses that we've gotten. So the majority of people don't feel like they are that familiar. This question looked at how competent would you be to discuss the following topics to a client with an intellectual disability? And again, the majority of respondents don't feel that comfortable with these terms. In your clinical work, how often has any of the following topics been discussed as a consideration for treatment? And usually, when it comes to LGBTQIA issues, they're not being discussed. Cognitive dissonance refers to a situation revolving conflicting attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. This produces a feeling of discomfort, leading to an alteration in one of these attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors to reduce the discomfort and restore balance. Cognitive dissonance theory suggests that we have an inner drive to hold all of our attitudes and beliefs in harmony and avoid disharmony or dissonance. In thinking about diversity and cognitive dissonance, at least back in 2016, how many people identified as being culturally competent? It's interesting to note this in some of the work that I'm doing, because would you still consider yourself culturally responsive or culturally competent or sensitive if you aren't familiar with some of the LGBTQIA+ language or the individuals and their needs? When new truths compete with established beliefs, we tend to respond defensively. We get defensive to respond to all the psychological stressors that emerge from such inner battles. This is especially true when our current beliefs place us in a privileged bubble. Think about what opposing thoughts you might have. And do you stick with your core belief? When you do you notice yourself getting defensive? Practicing and engaging in naming cognitive dissonance? You should reflect and be self-aware to help overcome some of these ideas and acknowledge the fact that you struggle. Paul Gorski teaches cognitive dissonance, or at least he did back in 2009. He used it as a social justice teaching tool. One of his activities was Who Said It, and it's a perception quiz. So you see a question up here on the board. Of all the evils for which man has made himself responsible, none is so degrading, so shocking, or so brutal as his abuse of the better half of humanity. To me, the female sex is not the weaker sex. So who do you think said this? I hear Gandhi. Anyone else? Gloria Steinem. Any guesses? So the correct answer is C. It is Gandhi. So is anyone, surprised about thinking about this quote, considering its source? Why have the views of Gandhi been erased from mainstream history? Because I've never heard any of his quotes relating to this. And who is served by this filtering of information? What question has this raised for you regarding what you think about history? How might acquiring the new knowledge presented by this question inform the way that you react to new information? So you might feel uncomfortable. I might have pointed out some of your biases. You might have a little cognitive dissonance, but it's important to remember that biases are normal. And like I said before, we're all biased. And we just need to take the time to self-reflect and decide what we're going to do with those biases. In looking at some diversity trends for ABAI and APBA, my colleague and I went through the electronic programs from 2018 to 2020. For the variable gender, the term male, female, and non-binary were searched for using the keyword search. For the variable sexual preference, the term heterosexual, LGBTQIA, LGBTQ, and LGBT were searched using the keyword search as well. For the variable geography, the terms urban, suburban, and rural were searched for using the keyword search. For the variables race, ethnicity, language, socioeconomic, religion, and titles of conferences were manually searched for any mention of a related term. This was done because the number of singular terms used to search for the keywords was too vast. For any presentation that had diversity or culture in the title, it was coded as a diversity or cultural in general, and not a specific diversity variable. Interrelated reliability was conducted for the comments data and was at 100% for APBA. Based on the preliminary data analyzed, it appears that ABAI offers more presentations that speak to diversity than APBA. Some variables not included in the post are due to space, but the variable most found for diversity sessions were gender and geography for ABAI. The variable most found for diversity sessions for APBA were diversity and culture in general. There were no presentations related to religion for either of these. For APBA, there were also no presentations on sexual preference or language. and ABAI did not have any presentations related to race and culture until 2014, and they did not have any presentations in sexual orientation or preferences. So we've come, I'm going to say, like, relatively a long way. It's clear that there's still a lot more work that we need to do, and we need to hear from people like you. There's also a lack of social validity reporting. In a review of research articles in the 30-year publication of JABA, Carr and his colleagues examined two aspects of social validity: treatment outcome and treatment acceptability. Treatment outcome and acceptability measures were found to be reported in less than 13% of articles. Social validity measures were rarely discussed until the 1970s, after the publication of key articles on the topic were published. Carr and colleagues also found that those studies performed in a naturalistic setting were more likely to report on social validity. However, while the number of articles including social validity information peaked in the 1980s at around 30%, there's been a steady decline of inclusions of such information to roughly 25% of the research articles in JABA. Wolf discussed three factors which should be considered when examining social validity types of social validity. The first being validation of behavioral goals, the second being social appropriateness of the treatment, the third is on social importance of the effects of behavioral treatment, and the need to incorporate social validity on three levels. The social significance of the goals. Are these the specific goals that society really wants? The social appropriateness of the procedure. Do the ends justify the means? That is, do the parents, caregivers, and other consumers consider the treatment procedures acceptable? And also the social importance of the effects. Are the consumers satisfied with the results? All the results, even the unpredicted ones. So right now in your practice, or if you're involved in writing manuscripts, how many times are you asking these questions and including this information? So my colleague and I looked at social validity reporting in 2015, and we didn't actually end up publishing this because someone beat us to it. But there was a notable increase in social validity reporting in 2015. In 2006, there was also an increase in the reporting of social importance effects. In 2004, we weren't able to analyze that due to a data input error. So what does this mean? So we're seeing an increase from the 20% back in the 80s, but is that increase enough? It's important to remember the recipient of intervention services are not necessarily the ones who request or pay for the service, and that the conceptualization of clients as the consumers of the service needs to be broadened to identify different levels of direct and indirect consumers, such as family members and the community. For example, when consumers of particular cultural backgrounds have a belief in the value system differs from those typical mainstream American professionals, these can influence the responses to social validity assessment. Consumers who ascribe to typical values of collectivist cultures like Asia and Latin America have been shown to be more sensitive regarding how they express their opinions in a public setting. They're more likely to perceive professionals as authority figures to be respected. These consumers, who may not be familiar with communicating with professionals as partners, may not feel comfortable about providing less favorable satisfaction ratings because it deviates from the normal practices. They may perceive such feedback as a display of disrespect that can negatively affect the personal relationship with the professional. By understanding consumers' cultural way of relating to and communicating with others, behavior analysts can more effectively work with them and obtain the desired social validity feedback with greater accuracy. It may be that consumers whose cultural backgrounds are different than analysts require more education regarding the purpose and function of social validity assessment processes. Studies have shown that multicultural consumers better understand to and relate to therapeutic contexts, and the treatment process or outcome are positively affected. Consideration of consumers' cultural backgrounds when collecting social validity data can thus provide insights onto how to obtain better quality social validity feedback. I wanted to spend not much time now talking about cross-cultural supervision, because really it's the only type of supervision that I've known. And I wonder if people are aware of just how amazing the experience can be if you address the elephant in the room, which is diversity. So cross-cultural supervision exists in all different areas. You know, it's not just looking at race, but you can also do cross-cultural supervision across many areas. So we all know that the BACB has certain supervision requirements, and some places there are a lack of BCBAs who can supervise for a variety of reasons. So cultural responsivity, which we've also seen in the ethics code, includes a culturally sensitive worldview, a competent knowledge base, and you're acting as a culturally sensitive individual and sharing the power of stakeholders. Culturally responsive supervisors acknowledge the fact that the supervisees can be experts with first-hand experience on their culture and call upon that knowledge. They may also use cultural advisors and work to distinguish differences between cross-cultural relationships. The supervisor acknowledgement of existence in culture in the supervisor relationship and active exploration of the impact of culture in the relationship is going to benefit the supervision process. The supervisor really calls upon that supervisee to kind of lead them and, tell me about your experience as a minority. Ideally, cultural supervision should encourage the development and growth of the supervisee and address or alleviate any potential ethnic and cultural barriers with supervision. If the supervisor does not address cultural issues, the supervisee's interpersonal growth may be hindered. For example, the supervisee might feel offended, upset, distressed, uncomfortable, scared, and unable to meet their client's needs if their cultural needs are not addressed. And I didn't have these discussions with my supervisor, and I think I still had a fantastic supervision experience, but I wonder if they ever asked me about, being discriminated at work, how that might have looked, having experienced racism, sexism, and ageism working. So the benefits are that it does increase personal awareness of cultural issues and better consideration of culture in case conceptualization. You have increased levels of multicultural sensitivity and an overall improved supervisory experience. In general, you get to know another culture, you have increased knowledge about your own culture, you get to learn about yourself and be more self-aware and unafraid to address cultural differences. Your supervisee might feel more comfortable, you might have improvements in the supervision experience, you're going to help the supervisee develop a cultural identity and become more self-aware, and realization of commonalities to bridge differences. There's going to be a mutual appreciation, understanding, and professional and sensitized supervision practices. Specific to supervisors, some of the benefits are you are going to be helped in becoming more self-aware of your own biases. You're going to ensure that you have a solid cultural identity and understanding of the complexities of culture. You're going to be able to facilitate discussions on topics where supervisees can feel more supported. You're going to build trust in the relationship and assist in the development and growth of the supervisee, which isn't that really the purpose of supervision anyway? But this isn't to say that there aren't challenges. Challenges exist. For example, interpersonal differences, differences of values, different communication styles, different languages, different goals, different supervision expectations, power differential, discrimination, difficulty with trust and openness, and a lack of multicultural competency and sensitivity. We discussed why diversity and culture are important considerations, and just to add to those in closing. Culture may impact the time of diagnoses and access to services, and increase self-awareness. We need to first, though, understand our own cultural systems, reflect, discuss, or communicate through mediums about one's diverse interactions, engage in mindfulness, scientific mindfulness, and reflect on one's clients. For example, the supervisor might take the supervisee's lack of eye contact as a negative quality, when in fact the supervisee's culture believes that a lack of eye contact shows respect. Similarly, a supervisee might be taught never to question authority, so won't speak up or ask questions. So you need to think about how can you facilitate better communication and understanding of these differences. There also might be an unwillingness to request help due to biases or fear of validating pre-existing isms. For example, a female BCBA might not want to ask for a day off to watch her child because it's going to confirm a perceived family's opinion that mothers should not be working. So we don't have time for this, but one tool that you can use to evaluate your self-awareness is the MASS, the Multicultural Awareness, Knowledge, and Skills Survey. And it's a 60-item survey, and you respond to all 60 items. Obviously, this isn't made for behavior analysts, but it is a tool that you can use and reflect about your own self-assessment of multicultural awareness, knowledge, and skills. So I said that this was a walk the walk, talk the talk kind of discussion, and I've given you a lot of information. So what I'd like you to do is take your calendar, take a piece of paper, take something out, and I'd like you to have a calendar event from 1 year from today. And I want you to write your committed action. If you needed to write it down in smaller steps and do more frequent reminders, that's okay, but really make yourself accountable. And these are a couple of committed actions that you can take, but it's, not an exhaustive list. So thank you for your participation, commitment, and action.
Welcome. Thank you for still being here with us this afternoon for our expert panel. We're going to be talking about the journal process, the editorial process. And I will leave this up for just a moment while I tell you that the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years has been an exciting time with many more journals, much larger volumes, many more publications, and a whole slew of female editors of our journals. Yes, and for at least one of our behavioral journals, the very first female editor ever. Sitting here to my right, Dr. Amy Odom. Yeah. For another of our behavioral journals, the first female editor ever, Dr. Anna Pettersdotter. And for two of our other journals, Behavior Analysis and Practice and JABA, not the first, but still awesome, Stephanie Peterson, and me, Linda LeBlanc. So one of the things to keep in mind is that you do not become the editor of a journal without having done almost everything there is to do as part of a journal, and that includes a lot of amazing learning opportunities and hard work and sometimes gut work, and you also participate as a person who is submitting to that journal long before you ever get to the point where you have any role in the editorial process. So I guess what I'm saying about that is that those who submit to a journal are part of the editorial process. There's a whole other side of the editorial process, and the first step is usually submit, reject, submit, reject, submit, reject, submit, reject, and hopefully you keep pressing the lever. So before we tell you about everybody's accolades, I just want to say, of the four of us, raise your hand if you've had articles rejected from the journal you edited. Yeah. Yeah.
While I was editor.
While you were editor. Oh, yes. That's what I'm talking about. No bias here. No favoritism. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about the editorial process. If you have never submitted an article and it's something you're interested in, think about how you might get yourself on that journey. If you have submitted articles and you've ever had one rejected, you're in great company. We can have a drink and commiserate about that because it absolutely happens to all of us. If you have questions about the process, there should be time at the end. But what I would like to do is have each of our panelists talk a little bit about, and it's up there for your review as well, but some of the various positions that they have held for journals, and for the journal that they have edited, to tell us something about that particular journal and its role within our overall field of behavior analysis. Anna, would you be willing to get us started?
Sure. Is this working? All right. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the analysis of verbal behavior. So I was the editor of that journal, 2012 to 14. TVB was is a journal that's been coming out since the early 1980s, and it was originally a newsletter of the Verbal Behavior Special Interest Group of the ABAI, and so some of the people who were involved in getting that off the ground were Mark Sundberg and other students of Jack Michaels at Western Michigan University, and they felt that this journal was needed. So TAVB is it's a niche journal for research on verbal behavior. And these students were doing research in which they drew heavily upon Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. And they found that this research was getting rejected from Behavior Analysis Journal, so often on the ground that they were drawing on Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. So they felt that an outlet was needed for this type of research. That's why they established the analysis of verbal behavior. Then the ABAI took over and has been publishing TAVB since, my goodness, maybe 30 years ago, or maybe a little over 30 years. And I feel like I had one more thing that I wanted to say about that, and now I don't remember what that is. But yeah, that's basically TAVB. Today, I would say research is not ever rejected, I think, from Java or JAB on the grounds that it is on verbal behavior. So that's not really an issue anymore, but I think TAVB kind of remains an outlet for research that research on both applied. I think most of the research that appears in it today is applied. There's also a little bit of basic research every now and then. So it is essentially an outlet for research on verbal behavior.
Okay, is this on? Yes, okay. I'm not sure if I have to turn it on or it's already on, but it appears to be on. So I am the editor of Behavior Analysis in Practice. That journal was founded in around 2008. That's when the first issue came out. So I think maybe the journal was founded maybe in 2007. I'm not exactly sure, but the very first editor-in-chief for Behavior Analysis in Practice was a woman. That was Dorothea Lerman. So that's very exciting that she was the founding editor. I was fortunate enough to be one of the founding associate editors of the journal as well. And I remember sitting on, we used to use Skype back then. I remember sitting on a Skype call with Dorothy and Tim Vollmer talking about what we should name the journal. And maybe it was Greg Hanley, I can never remember, it was one of those two. And we were saying, wow, this is super cool. Like, how often do you get the opportunity to name a journal? And I remember when we were talking about BAP being the name, somebody joking about Emerald, and I guess he does that cooking show, and like, bam, right? So we were like, BAP, you know? But when the journal was founded, we sort of envisioned that it would be a journal that really focuses directly on practice. I think, you know, one might argue, well, that's what the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis does. And so we had a lot of discussion about how's Java going to be different from this, and how are we going to be different from Java. And we don't want BAP to be the journal that's like, well, you didn't make it into Java, so, but you can get the consolation prize as BAP. Like, that was something we really didn't want to happen. We wanted it to have its own niche that was important. And I think, like, when I think of Java, I think of pretty heavy-duty science on the principles of behavior in lots of different areas, and it may not necessarily directly relate to practice, right? Because we're trying to understand how the principles work in the applied world. Of course, Linda can talk to that more. So we said, you know, this should be a journal that what you read about applies directly to practice in some way. Not about autism practice, about practice of behavior analysis across all the different areas that behavior analysis can be practiced. So that's kind of what the journal is still about today. There are many ways that we can apply the principles of behavior analysis across industry, autism, college teaching, you know, clinical issues, and so forth. So we look for papers in all those different areas. I think for, you know, early in the inception, I think the journal struggled to figure out what it wanted to be exactly and how it was going to look, because we still want the science of behavior to be applied. in the papers, and there should be high quality of the science that you're reading. But it's still different from Java, right? So that's like a fine line, I think, sometimes between the two journals. And so I think the journal continues to navigate and find its way as one of the younger journals among the group. So I think, does that cover what you wanted me to cover?
That was fantastic.
Okay.
Okay, I'll go next. I'm Linda LeBlanc. I'm the current editor of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. It was founded in 1968 by the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, and it was the new baby journal with JAB, which Amy will tell you about, as the journal that had already existed for 10 years. The Society has published that journal as a nonprofit, and since 2012 has done so in conjunction with Wiley Publishers. The journal really was, and many times journals are founded based on a perceived need of the field for an outlet. People have ideas, notions, data. For some reason, these things may not be valued the way we think they should in some other way. Certainly at that time, behavior analytic work, particularly single subject design work, was getting some pushback as the cognitive revolution was occurring and statistical models were really becoming the dominant models in virtually all of the psychology journals. And I think that both JAB and JABA were founded to create outlets for behavioral scientists who valued a different methodology that examined the subject as its own control to investigate learning theory and behavioral process. JABA was different in that it was founded to have a home for applied science. That is, application to solve socially meaningful problems in applied context, using behavior analytic methods, and often using single subject designs. One of the interesting things that I have kind of learned in my perusal of every article ever published in Java is that so many of the things in our textbooks that we think of as our methods, all of that, much of that anyway, originated in some articles in Java. The changing criterion design, a variety of our different measurement procedures. And so it really was a place where the technology of our science to be able to examine applied issues was evolving, as well as a database of many of the outcomes, the meaningful ones that could be achieved by our applied science. So that's the role that Java plays in our field.
Thank you. So I edited the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, and it was founded in 1958, and its mission was to publish experimental investigations relevant to the behavior of individual organisms. And that remains its focus and its goals today, its mission. It is a journal published by the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior along with Java. And it was founded because there were not a lot of outlets at the time that were willing to publish research using the designs that found a home in JAB. So most of the work at the time was group designs using inferential statistics. And so JAB was founded as an outlet for research using single subject designs. And it is almost exclusively publishing laboratory studies a lot of it with non-human animals, although also a lot of human research, and increasingly translational research. So that's JAB's mission, and I want to say that although I was the first woman, the only woman to edit that journal so far, I was not the first woman who was qualified.
Yes. All right, so I guess one of the things that I hope you come away from this panel discussion with is an understanding that the people who engage in the service of leading these journals are people, regular old people who have done every step of the process, and it is an illusion that those who have a lot of publications got all their stuff published. If we had a list of all the stuff we ever submitted that got bounced on as tiny, it would perhaps be a lengthy list as well. And so for all of us, there was a certain first step and first experience in the editorial process. And I'll start us off by sharing what some of that was for me, and then I'd love to hear other people's stories. My major professor very much viewed himself as a researcher. He was the editor of a journal. He viewed science as a tremendously valuable part of clinical psychology and behavioral psychology. He frequently said to me, if you're going to do research and you're scared to submit it, it means you don't care if others waste time figuring out the same thing that you already know. Okay. I reviewed for his journal before, basically as soon as I knew how to do anything. It was important to him that I understand even the reviewers are just people, and they're going to say what they say, but they're people just like you. And so don't be afraid of submitting. And some of them aren't going to get in. So the first time I submitted a paper was to JABA, and it was a mentored process. A fella that I care dearly about, Dr. Tim Vollmer, was a brand new first-year assistant professor at LSU, and he did not have very many graduate students, and I worked with him on some projects, and we submitted one, and there happened to be a special issue on functional analysis that was about to come out in JABA, and the paper we wrote was on automatic reinforcement, and there had not been that much research in that. So it was rejected. Invite resubmission. Or maybe not even invite resubmission, I don't know, but somehow we came to be able to talk with the AE at that time, and he helped us know a different way to frame our data that would make a different and arguably more valuable contribution to the literature. And we did reframe the story, and it was subsequently published. So, man, that feels great, 1 for 1. And then it was probably 9 smackdowns, right? Yep. No, don't think so. So, but I had people contextualizing that for me. That takes a lot of persistence, and I think that first experience of a reject, even if it subsequently got modified, would have been a bit more crushing if I had not had someone there kind of explaining, no, look at what these reviewers are saying. Even though they don't like that, look how much it brought out of them to comment about, and it stimulated ideas. So for me, that mentoring really helped, from both of those people, really helped to set the tone. That it's okay to submit. It's somebody else's notion or decision about whether it's going to get published or not. My job is to try to do the good work and just put it out there and see what it can influence.
So my first publication was a laboratory study with animals, and I was the third author of 3. And that was an experience that I've really carried with me. It was a study that had, a lot of it had been completed when I started on the project, and I did the sort of most straightforward, easiest parts of the manuscript, like method or something like that. And that's a model I use in my laboratory. As soon as a graduate student arrives in my laboratory, they just jump on a project that they feel they have some interest in, and then they'll be very quickly writing methods and things like that, so that you get a lot of experience with the process, starting out with having the most clearly defined, straightforward role. And so I thought that was a really good experience for me. I had a bit of a rude awakening the first time I submitted a paper without my advisor on the paper. By the time I finished graduate school, I remember this was back in the hard copy days. I gave my advisor a manuscript the very first time he had ever seen it. I was at that point, about to defend my dissertation, and I just gave him a manuscript. And I remember getting it back, and I was looking through, and there was nothing written on any of the pages. And then on page 10, he wrote, "I'm just letting you know that I am reading." I was like, wow, okay. So by the time I left, he was just like, "That looks great, submit it." So then the first thing I submitted without his name on it, this, again, remember, it was back in the days of paper. I got the reviews back and was so excited to see what they said. And one of the reviewers said that I should save a tree, meaning it was not worth the paper it was printed on. And the other reviewer said that it could be published as is. And so that was my first introduction to, frankly, the cruel side of reviewing. And that's been one of the things that I have tried to change, is there's absolutely no reason to be unkind to people, and particularly not entry-level authors. So that's something I've always, based on that experience, I've always tried to be kind and helpful. And I even once, as editor, there's a category of rejection called desk reject, which is one of the saddest categories. I mean, all the rejection categories are sad, right? But the saddest is a desk reject, and that's when the editor reads it and is like, "I'm not even going to send this out for review. I'm just going to reject it right here. It's not going to go through the peer review process." Like, I can tell looking at this, there's absolutely no way. So I had to do a desk reject one time for some authors, and I tried to carefully explain why I was doing that, and they wrote back and thanked me for the helpful advice and how kind and supportive I was, and I was like, oh, I can't believe it, because I just was like, no, we're not even reviewing that. So that's one of the things I've really tried to do in the process, is to think about the person on the other end of the review, the people who are receiving that feedback, and how negative and harsh feedback can turn off a lot of people. Like, people don't want to be told that their work isn't worth the paper it's printed on. You spend a lot of time processing that you could have just spent trying to make your manuscript better. So
I want to punch that reviewer in the nose.
You want me to go? Yeah, so my first experience, so I actually believe I was trained as a reviewer before I ever submitted a paper to a journal. So my mentor, Jim Carr, he himself was a very prolific researcher. He was also associate editor of JABA at that time, so he was very well versed in editorial processes. And so I also had him for research methods, and in research methods, one of our assignments was actually to review an already published journal article. And then, you know, of course, I was doing research in his lab, but I was being very slow to get to the point of submitting anything for publication. And, you know, in part, I was afraid. I didn't want to submit until I was kind of confident that, you know, I wasn't going to get rejected. I thought that would be an awful experience if that happened. Now I know it's fine. It's fine to be rejected. But so he essentially trained me to be a reviewer as well by having me practice reviewing manuscripts that he was sent for review. So he shared with me reviews that he had written in the past, so both reviews of articles that he'd recommended accepting and reviews of articles that he'd recommended rejecting. And so I read those very, very carefully, and I tried to pay attention to, you know, the kinds of things that were that the review addressed. And then I tried writing my own, and I think, you know, I wrote some together with Jim, or I wrote my own review that maybe he incorporated into his review. And then ultimately, I think my first actual reviewer assignment also occurred before I had ever submitted anything that I wrote by myself. And I think this experience actually was very helpful, because then when for the first time I was writing up my own article that I was going to submit for publication, I put on my reviewer hat and I asked, you know, as a reviewer, what are the questions that I would ask about this article? What would I criticize? And I tried to anticipate it and you know, respond to it in the actual paper. And I'm happy to say that particular paper was accepted on first try. Of course, wasn't always so successful. I think, you know, a lot got accepted eventually, but I think one of my grad school papers with Jim, it took about 14 years to get published. So, you know, sometimes it just takes a while. You try again. Sometimes you wait a little, and sometimes you wait a long time, but yeah, then you know, just look at what the reviewers said, you improve your paper accordingly, and you try again, and often that turns out well. Yeah, I don't know if I have more to say. You want to go, Stephanie?
So my first publication, I was not first author on. I was in graduate school, and we had to do a project, and Linda Cooper was doing a study looking at different variables and how they affect children's problem behavior in the classroom. And so I decided, I was a classroom teacher at that point in time while I was taking that class, so I implemented that with a couple of my kids and videotaped them and coded them after school. And I think Linda collected the IOA data with me, and she ended up writing that up as a little piece for teaching exceptional children. So that was kind of a fun introduction into that process. But the first one I submitted as first author myself, I was a doctoral student, and we had done a little outpatient evaluation for a girl who had a trach and would pull out her trach when her mom would ask her to do things that she didn't want to do, and it was a pretty effective behavior for getting her way. But when we ran the functional analysis, we could not get her to engage in any problem behavior, and so we modified the functional analysis procedures to reinforce MANs for breaks, and then we put the MANs on extinction, and then we saw the problem behavior. So we wrote that up, submitted it to JABA, and as a brief report, and it was rejected pretty soundly. And I was very disappointed, and Dave said to me, it's okay, you know, everything that gets published goes into the Library of Congress. And sometimes reviewers are helping us from making a really bad mistake and putting something out there that just shouldn't be out there. I think this one's just not ready yet. And so I was kind of like, well, that's an interesting perspective. I'll tell you a side story. That one was rejected, and I had submitted it as a part of a symposium at ABAI that year. And Bud Mace was the AE on that paper. And so then I had to go to ABAI and present it, knowing it had been rejected. And the discussant on my symposium was Bud Mace. So I was like, oh my God, the editor who rejected this is the discussant. He's going to tear me to shreds. And of course, I cited Jack Michael a lot in the intro, and Jack Michael was like in the second row in the audience. It was like the most anxiety-producing event in my entire career, but Bud was very kind in his discussion, and Jack was also very kind after, so that was nice. And then I guess I'll tell you two other very short stories, and one is that for my dissertation, that's the first one I actually did publish as first author. But before we published it, Dave went down to the University of Kansas for something, and he said, can I present your data while I'm down there? And I said, sure. And when he came back, Don Baer wrote him a 4-page letter critiquing that study. I was horrified when I learned that, because I thought, oh my God, this is my dissertation, and Don Baer's just like tearing it apart. Dave never showed me that letter, but what he said to me was, Don Baer cared enough and was interested enough in your work to sit down and write a 4-page letter about it. You should view that as a reinforcer, not as a punisher. And so I try to reiterate that to authors too, that when reviewers take their time, and associate editors, to really sit down and carefully read your work and critique it, even if the outcome is a rejection, think about all the time they spent devoting themselves to your work and giving you feedback to help you in the future. And sort of keeping that frame of mind has helped me a lot when I'm reading reviews that are difficult for me to read, because I don't like that they're not accepting my work. So I would just encourage you to think about things that way when you can. And then the last thing I'll say is with regard to persistence. One of my students was trying to publish her dissertation, and it was rejected from 3 journals. And we submitted it. Each time we took the reviewer's feedback and improved it, and we submitted it to Jobim ultimately, who did accept it. And then her paper won the Most Influential Paper of the Year award from that journal. So just because you get a paper rejected from one journal doesn't mean your paper sucks, right? It just might mean it wasn't the right match for that journal and what they needed at this point in time.
That is so true. And, you know, we are in a position now where we do have many more journals than we did in 1967. And it is about finding the right match for your paper. Okay, well, I came up with another question. You know, we've talked a lot about the notions of mentorship and also sponsorship. And I wanted folks to speak about how they came to be associate editor, whether they were sponsored, if they happened to know who that sponsor was. I'll kick us off. I was appointed as an associate editor by Pat Fryman, and he told me that you know, I had a pretty good breadth of topics that I could cover, and that was valuable. But really, this is someone you know well, his associate editor, Jennifer McComas, just spoke very highly of the quality of my reviews, that I was always kind to the authors, and that I was detailed and always on time, and that she really valued my reviews. And the fact that she spoke so highly of me, Pat said, well, great. You know, I'm sure she'll be fine. So really, Jennifer used her credibility to get me an opportunity. I don't know exactly who nominated me as editor for JABA, but I suspect that it was Dorothy Learman. And she has sponsored me in many ways, as well as some other people here, to whom she has been a great advocate. So very often, you know, I don't know if it's a popularity contest. People have to know who you are. You have to be skilled. But it is about someone caring enough about you and the quality of what you do to be willing to speak up on your behalf, I think.
That side of the table.
All right. I honestly have no idea how I came to be editor of BAP. I got a call from Maria Malat one night when I was sitting at home late in the fall saying, I'd like you to be nominated for BAP. And so I don't know where that came from. I didn't ask her. It could have been Maria. I don't know. I can tell you, you could have knocked me over with a feather when she made that phone call, because I had no idea that that was coming. So I feel fortunate and blessed. And so whoever was my sponsor, I'll just say thank you. I really appreciate it. I will say that so I was also a senior editor for Education and Treatment of Children, so I can speak to that one a little more because I do know how that one happened. I had published a paper in ETC at some point, and I was in my first year at Gonzaga University teaching, and Dave Wacker, my mentor, called me up and he said, why don't you propose to the editors of ETC a special issue on functional analysis in applied settings? And I was like, okay, like, I don't know how to do that, but that sounds fun. And he said, you could, propose that you're going to ask some authors to submit some papers, and we talked about who those might be. And so I didn't even know the editors of ETC, but I sort of took this leap of faith and said, I'm going to write up a proposal for this and send it in. I mean, what's the worst that can happen, right? They say no. So I sent it in, and they said, oh, that sounds great. So then suddenly I was guest editing an issue of ETC. And so we pulled that off and put out a nice issue. And then they asked me to be the book review editor for them. And I said, okay, I was a second or third year professor at that point. That sounds like a good thing to do. And then one year I was at ABAI, and the two senior editors said, can you have lunch with us? And I said, sure. And they said, at some point we're going to retire and we need somebody to take over. If you're interested, we'd like to start grooming you to take over that role. So it was the two men who were the senior editors of that journal who did that. And I guess the reason I tell you that story is that if you're interested in doing this kind of work, put yourself out there, reach out to editors, talk to them about things like special issues, ask how you can help, get involved. And that's really what led me down that path with that journal. Like I said, BAP was sort of like magic, so I'm not sure. But hopefully that helps.
Okay, so, the analysis of verbal behavior, how I became the editor of that, I'll be completely honest, I had my arm twisted into it. So this was pretty early in my career, so I did not even have tenure yet when I started, and the last thing I actually wanted to do was to be the editor of a journal at that point in time. Now, TAVB is a very small journal, so this is not like a major workload like Java or JAP. It's pretty small, but it was still not what I wanted to do. However, the ABAI publication board really needed to recommend a potential editor to the ABAI Executive Council. They wanted to pick someone who was already involved and interested in the journal, and I already was an associate editor. I'd served on the editorial board as well. And I guess nobody else, I guess everybody else had said, no, I won't do it at all. And yeah, I had my arm twisted into it, and that's how that happens. Now with how I became associate editor of JABA, on the other hand, I started reviewing as a guest reviewer for that journal, I think relatively early in my career, and then I had the opportunity to participate in the AE mentorship program when that was brand new. This was when Dorothy Lerman was editor, and so Rick Smith was my mentor, so I handled several papers under his supervision, and I think as a result of that, maybe I did okay, because I was then invited to join as an associate editor. I have no idea how I became an associate editor of JF. Maybe ask Amy. Yeah, that's that.
Oh, well, that's pretty funny. So I know the reason that I asked Anna to be associate editor of JAB is because she has an outstanding reputation for fairness, thoroughness, punctuality, and those are all the things that you really look for. So I got my start as I did a guest review that Steve Higgins, I was a postdoctoral fellow, and Steve Higgins said, oh, I got this request to review this manuscript for JAB, and that was back when everything was mailed. So, and I remember JAB stationery was gray. And so he hands me this gray envelope and is like, would you like to do this? And I said, sure. And so I looked at it and I wrote my review. I had published my own papers by then, and then I gave it to Steve to look at, and he's like, oh, this is really good, but could you be nicer? And so I specifically just went through and made it nicer. I said the same thing, but nicer. And I still do that. Every time I write a review, I write my review and I try to be nice, and then I let it sit. And then I go back and I look at it. I'm like, how can I be nicer? So, and the hilarious thing is I recently reviewed a manuscript, and it's anonymous. And the author is here at this conference, and she said, did you review our manuscript? I know you reviewed our manuscript. I recognize your tone. And I was like, I did. It's
You were the nice
funny.
one.
That's actually what they thought. So it was pretty funny. Like, I worked really hard on my tone to be helpful and to think about how people receive reviews and how to be helpful to them and encouraging. So I started out as a guest reviewer, then Len Green asked me to be on the board of editors of JAB, and I had been publishing pretty much most of my work I published in JAB. So that's one way, I think, to get on the board of editors is if you're publishing a lot of your work there. So you can even just kind of concentrate like on one journal if you can. Maybe that will like increase your signal, and they'll be like, oh, I see this person publishing a lot in our journal. So Len asked me to be on the board of editors, and I didn't say no to any requests to review, and I was always punctual. And if you know me as a person, you know that I'm not 100% punctual with other things. But I was 100% punctual. I was very careful. I put my all into these reviews and worked really hard on my tone. And so then Len told me that I reviewed like twice as many manuscripts as anyone else 1 year. And then Jim Mazur asked me to be associate editor. And I remember I really thought about it really hard because I was pregnant at the time, and it was my first child, and I didn't really know what to expect. So it took me a bit to think about it, and then I realized, like, I love reviewing. I love thinking about experiments, and so even though a lot of my other responsibilities I was able to let go when I first had my baby, that was one that I never let go. I enjoyed it. It was like my treat. I got to read manuscripts when my baby was nursing or sleeping or whatever, and so So yeah, I really enjoyed it. And then I'm not sure exactly who asked me to be, or who nominated me for editor, but I do know that that process, the nomination committee is made up of the former editors. So I knew that Jim and Lynn had appointed me to various roles, so I'm confident that it was them. So.
All right, well, we do not have much time left, so this last one we're just going to have to give a sentence or two. What's one piece of advice that you might have for young professionals who want to become involved in the process? And Stephanie, do you want to, or Anna, want to get us started?
I know I thought about this ahead of time, but now that we've talked about so much, I'm trying to remember where it fits in. I guess I would just say, as I said to people recently, if you haven't had the opportunity to participate in the review process yet, you can reach out to editors and tell them that you're interested in being a reviewer for the journal and doing some guest reviews. So I just ask people to send me an email that gives a letter of interest, a copy of their vita, and a little bit about themselves and what areas they feel comfortable doing reviews in, and then I pass that along to my associate editors so that they can use those folks as guest reviewers and get involved in the process.
I would like to take a question from the audience to see if there's advice that anyone's looking for.
We actually are out of time.
Oh. Okay.
Okay.
I have one, and then that'll just be mine.
Okay.
I'll be quick.
Okay.
That's my time.
Hi, my name is Warner Leland. I am a collaborator on the Retract Hate campaign that has been asking SAAB to take steps toward retracting Riker and Lovaas 1974. And I know that that's an elaborate ask, but I truly believe in the power of our journals to shape how we approach science and how we reduce harm to our participants and thus to our clients in a field that's founded on reliance on scientific knowledge. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you all are using your power and your privilege as editors to shape what contributing to the scientific literature looks like right now. There's so much that can be done in the way of phase change. And also if you have any advice for folks looking to get involved in advocacy and support for you all in making shifts that contribute to human rights of our participants and our clients.
Thank you so much for that question and for raising awareness. And I would say in terms of my advice for you for advocacy, I would say keep doing what you're doing because it's awesome. And that article is one that we have discussed many times, and we continue to think about that article and to the great harm that it has caused. And so I would say that there are discussions and there are things happening behind the scenes. There's been some action taken already, and I want you to know that it weighs heavily on our hearts. And so, yeah, it's something we think about.
Yeah. And I would say that the thing we did last year was to respond to outreach from people. I actually had not even known that the article existed, and I would say the same was true about half of the board because it was published, you know, almost 50 years ago, before some of us were born. So speak out, and I think that what we did was investigate, consider all the merits, consider the process for retraction, and then make sure that we could do something that would create an opportunity for others to become more educated about this and to potentially do some other things. And I will say this, it's been less than a year, and we've had multiple articles submitted in response, and a couple of them at a higher rate than other articles have actually been accepted at some part in the process. So certainly the discussion continues at SAAB, but it's going to continue in the journal. And so what all of us can do is not only speak about things that maybe should not have been published previously but were, and speak about what we need to do going forward. And I will say this, I can confidently say there's not going to be any article like that published in JABA on my watch. And it would not surprise me if every editor up here were to say the same thing. So there are a new generation of professionals evaluating research. And I think this generation of professionals has an eye towards equity and human rights. So we can't undo what was done, but we can make sure it does not happen again.
Linda, can
Okay,
I
we need to stop, or
Okay.
we're going to be late for the Hall of Fame induction.
All right, thank you.
I would normally let this keep going, but the Hall of Fame induction is next, and I think it's so important for us to celebrate our the people who helped create our field. So we're going to take just a couple-minute break to get set up. Thank you.
assistant directors in order to help support them so we can provide the best services to our clients.
So my favorite part about my job is being able to work with all the different clinical teams across the country and really spend time with everyone. I'm so grateful for what a wonderful, talented group of individuals that I get to work with every day.
We have a really strong team, and I like that I'm able to really rely on them.
I think my favorite part of my job is that I get to do a lot of different things and I'm never bored.
What I enjoy most about my job is being able to work with my team and being able to support them so we can come up with the best plans possible to provide clinical excellence for our clients.
Everyone who works in ABA knows that our work at times might look like child's play, but it's actually far from it. What people don't see, and what one daughter hinted at, is the ongoing data collection, critical analysis, and science-based decisions happening repeatedly behind the scenes. As a sponsor of WEBA's Hall of Fame, And as an organization committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, Learn is thrilled to commemorate the many talented and dedicated women at the forefront of our field, devoting their lives to the science of behavior and to nurturing the unique potential of every child and young adult with autism.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first annual induction for the Women in Behavior Analysis Hall of Fame. The mission statement for this effort is to honor the accomplishments of women pioneers in the field of behavior analysis and to create a historic record to educate behavior analysts on those women's contributions. There were many amazing, powerful, effective women around at the beginning of our field, the first 50 years of our field, and for the most part, they have not been as carefully documented in the record of accomplishments and accolades. However, they did amazing things, and they persisted during times when it was somewhat more difficult to succeed as a woman in behavior analysis. We owe them an enormous debt of gratitude, and our purpose is to help you know their fantastic stories. Our criteria are that the individuals inducted into this Hall of Fame have 40+ years of experience in the field, potentially retired or semi-retired, that we look at their awards and accolades, their scholarly contributions, but also their teaching, their mentoring, and their leadership positions. So, some of these women may not have published as many articles as others, but they did powerful things, particularly to lift the efforts of other women in behavior analysis. The inductees have been selected and will be selected based upon their ability to serve as a role model for all of you and for me. We have an all-female selection committee. Our intent is to keep it that way. The selection committee is appointed by the WEBA Hall of Fame committee chair, which is currently me, and I give thanks to Carol Pilgrim, Chada Dixon, and Dr. Denise Ross, who will be joining us momentarily from her home. We always have at least one other member of the WEBA Advisory Board. It is Dr. Denise Ross. And the WEBA staff help us to organize things. Our goal is to induct 4 to 6 new members each year. This year it will be 4. We also collect memorabilia as a living history display to share the accomplishments of women in the field of behavior analysis. Our intention is to get their published works, video documentation of their efforts, as well as personal things that we may be able to obtain that are meaningful as a record of their impact. There will be at the reception tonight Dr. Judy Favel, one of our inductees, and there will be an interactive display so that you will be able to explore some of the information presented in this presentation in greater detail. And each year we will add more wonderful people and more wonderful information about their accomplishments. We are here to honor these 4 beautiful human beings. We will introduce you to each one of them, and I have to say, as a committee, the experience of learning their stories was remarkably touching. I hope you will be just as touched.
Good afternoon. I'm Carol Pilgrim, and I have the tremendous honor today of introducing the first of the Women's Hall of Fame inductees, Dr. Beatrice Helene Barrett. Now, I'll admit to you that I've been pretty much in awe of Bea since I was a pup, but prepping for this presentation clarified for me just what an iconoclast she really was. Today, we definitely call Bea one badass woman. In her day, she was duking it out with the best of them, doing what it took to get this field of behavior analysis off and running, and then later staying the course. Now, it's impossible to do justice in these few minutes, of course, but to give just a feel for some of the pioneering arcs of her work, Bea was one of the very first to illustrate the potential of human operant laboratory work, one of the cornerstones of our field today, and one that's very near and dear to my own heart. She conducted seminal investigations of discrimination learning under carefully controlled conditions in individuals with developmental delays, but she didn't stop there. Her real focus was on showing how identifying individual differences in discrimination acquisition, measured in terms of response rate, could inform clinical assessments and the design of therapeutic interventions. She was a true translational scientist way before that was trendy, conceptualizing her laboratory and clinical work as all of a piece. Now, this led to approaching clinical targets in terms of their functions. Does that sound familiar? And Bea went on to make great strides in expanding interventions for individuals with intellectual disabilities to include academic skills. She established the first classroom program based completely on behavioral science in the 1960s. She was also one of the first to explore teaching non-professionals like parents and students to implement behavioral principles and thereby work towards greater generalization, all key themes in our work to this day. Now, there were numerous milestones throughout Bea's career, just a few of which are highlighted here. Her early training and professional experiences with standard clinical assessment were probably important establishing operations for her wholehearted embrace of response rate measures when she joined Og Lenslie and B.F. Skinner as a postdoc at Harvard. Well, Bea went on to highlight the use of rate measures in many publications across a wide range of journals and in her position of Director of Research at the Fernald State School for 30 years. Later in her life, she chaired the influential ABA Task Force on the Right to Effective Education, and she was then invited to write an introduction for a new edition of Skinner's Technology of Teaching. Well, that intended introduction grew into a full-blown book in its own right. Bea was convinced that Skinner's technical terminology in the book made it inaccessible to many of those who most needed to hear its message. Her translation of Skinner's Technology of Teaching was published just the year before her death. Now, Bea was beautiful and elegant, tall and slim, always tan. She was described as brilliant and kind, but not one to suffer fools lightly. And she was a woman of great passions. Bea was an avid open sea sailor, and by all counts cursed like one too, preferring to sail in the nude whenever possible. She loved science and the arts, and her cat Libby, short for libido, who often accompanied Bea to work and to conferences. Upon her death, Bea left legacy endowments, including a laboratory research program at the University of North Texas, an extensive modern art collection to the De Cordova Museum close to her home, and significant contributions to the Boston Ballet, as well as several organizations devoted to conservation of wildlife and the natural environment. Now, I'm sure you won't be surprised when I tell you that those who knew Bea speak glowingly of her influence. This is a quote from Kent Johnson, and it emphasizes Bea teaching him about true units of analysis, why they matter, and how they transformed his approach to education. And since it wouldn't be true to Bee's spirit if I didn't present at least some of her data to illustrate, here you see figures that speak to one of her major crusades. Now, each of these figures presents data from 3 groups of individuals: typical adults, typically developed 5 to 7-year-old children, and 12 to 54-year-old students from the Fernald State School, to whom she devoted so much of her life. For each group, data were collected on a number of basic academic tasks: writing numerals, naming numerals, counting tiles, and so on. And the data in the figure on the left are presented as percent correct. And Bee's key point was that if this was the only measure considered, you might conclude that the state school students were on par with the other groups, and thus well prepared for community living, deinstitutionalization being a major push at the time. The figure on the right, however, depicts the very same performances measured as rate of responding, with data from the state school students shown in the open bars. Clearly, there were important dimensions in need of additional intervention if the state school students were to be successful in community life. I love this picture of Bee, with her prized cumulative records, which she referred to as her paper dolls due to the necessary cutting and pasting. And these words by Carl Binder. You can read the quote yourself, of course, but I wonder how many behavior analysts will have their publications still being recommended 50 to 60 years from now. And I'll wrap up with this dedication to Bee from Hank Pennypacker and Og Lindsley in their standard acceleration chart book. In the eyes of those two, there could be no higher praise. In fact, you should know that to a person, every individual I corresponded with in researching Bee's contributions made the same observation, that behavior analysis would be better off today if more had heeded Bee's guidance. That's a legacy. May this Hall of Fame induction bring renewed attention to Bee's wisdom and insights. To Bee, please join me in giving her an award.
I'll be advancing the slides, but Dr. Denise Ross is going to be joining us to honor Martha Bernal.
Good afternoon. It is my honor to celebrate the life of Dr. Martha Bernal, accomplished psychologist and social activist. Martha Bernal was born in 1931 to Mexican-American parents who had immigrated to Texas during the Mexican Revolution. She found herself at odds with the traditional roles for women that were held by her family because she wanted to attend college instead of marrying and having children after high school. I'm sorry, I'm going to pause. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In her autobiography, she wrote, "Upon finishing high school, I literally had to conduct battle with my father about going to college. My father's view was that because we were women, we would be getting married, and a college education would be a waste. I went to work for a year after high school, saved my salary, and announced I would be going to college. Eventually, my father helped me financially," unquote. Martha attended undergrad at the University of Texas at El Paso, obtained her master's degree in special education at Syracuse University, and then began her doctoral degree in clinical psychology at Indiana University. While at Indiana University, she encountered significant barriers to her doctoral education, including financial, gender, and racial barriers. Although she was tempted to quit her doctoral program because of gender bias, she followed the advice of mentors to continue, and upon the completion of her doctoral degree in 1962, Martha Bernal became the first Latina to obtain a PhD in psychology and the first American of Mexican descent to obtain a doctoral degree in clinical psychology in the United States. It was after graduate school that Martha experienced two major transformations that would become the foundation of her phenomenal contributions to psychology. The first transformation was a shift from traditional psychotherapy to behavior analysis in her practice as a clinical psychologist. She studied the research of behavior analysts Charles Furster, Ogden Lindsley, Marianne DeMeyer, and Ibar Lovas, and observed the effectiveness of their work with children and adults. Martha subsequently used behavior analysis to develop parent training interventions that helped children with behavioral challenges, and she became nationally known for the use of effective measurement to assess children's behavior. In her autobiography, she stated that, quote, "My work and that of other pioneers in this field eventually led to the adoption of a very different theory about human problems, namely that children who had such problems were not internally ill or damaged, but had learned their maladaptive behaviors. They could unlearn them and could be taught a more adaptive behavioral repertoire," unquote. The second major transformation that she experienced was a deeper understanding of racial bias in psychology. In 1979, during a sabbatical from her faculty position at the University of Denver, Martha focused her attention on a long-held interest: the mental health of Latino children and the role of Latino psychologists. She studied the role of race in the social sciences for Mexican Americans and other American minorities. In the preface to her autobiography, she described her motivation for this phase of her career. She wrote, quote, "It seems important that the life experiences of female psychologists who are culturally diverse be represented among and understood by the members of the American Psychological Association. I also want readers to know how difficult it was for me to earn a PhD and to become the first nationally visible Hispanic female psychologist, and perhaps to review their definition of merit. Psychologists need to know of the many reasons why there was no other like me prior to 1962, and why there have been precious few since then," unquote. This shift in her focus resulted in significant advocacy for racial equity in the practice, training, and service of psychology. From that point on, Dr. Bernal highlighted the lack of psychologists and graduate students of color. She studied the identity development of Mexican American children, developed an ethnic identity questionnaire, gained national recognition for her advocacy for a multicultural psychology, provided significant leadership to professional organizations that supported psychologists of color, and received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Latino Psychology Conference and the American Psychological Association for her contributions to Hispanic psychologists. While Dr. Bernal is most widely known for her contributions to the treatment of children and multicultural psychology, she is also known for another major contribution: investing in the careers of Latino psychologists. Her mentee and former APA president, Dr. Melba Vasquez, told me that she was, quote, "a leader. She had great humor and cared very much about helping member psychologists find their way. I cannot say enough about how wonderful she was. Her spirit and her inspiration live on in all of us," unquote. In her obituary, Dr. Vasquez and her colleague Steve Lopez described her best when they said she was passionate about her ideas. She spoke out effectively against injustice. She maintained high standards of scholarship and professionalism. She demonstrated much compassion for fellow human beings, and she had considerable energy. Today, we honor Dr. Martha Bernal for her phenomenal contributions to the fields of psychology and behavior analysis. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chada Dixon. I'm going to talk with you about Eve Siegel, whom we're honoring today as an inductee in the Women in Behavior Analysis Hall of Fame.
I'll just leave it up so she can.
First, I'd like to share with you a few highlights, and then I'll walk you through her career and experiences in a bit more detail. In addition to being an early contributor to JAB, Siegel was the second woman to serve on the editorial board and as an associate editor. Her major professional contributions centered around three themes. The first was the experimental analysis of behavior with a focus on schedules of reinforcement and a process called induction. She worked to solve the puzzle of the first response. Behavior must occur before it can be reinforced, but how does the initial response come to be? The second theme is verbal behavior. She was an expert in and contributor to this area throughout her career. And the third theme broadly was related to behavior theory and ethical behavior. In the tradition of Skinner, she discussed and deconstructed problems of human behavior in daily life and society. And she also advocated for the well-being of laboratory animals. Eve Siegel earned her first degree when she was 17 years old from the Great Books program at the University of Chicago. This degree was centered around what were considered at the time to be the most important books to Western civilization. She continued to be a voracious and broad reader throughout her career, and this can be seen in the scholarly references that she makes in her writing. She completed a second undergraduate degree at the University of Minnesota under the advisement of Dr. Kenneth McCorkadale, who had been a student of B.F. Skinner. Completing a doctoral degree with Skinner seemed to be a natural next step for her, and she was accepted as a doctoral student in his lab, though she did this as a Radcliffe College student, as Harvard was not accepting female students, of course, in 1953. While she was there, Siegel took a class from Skinner on verbal behavior while he was putting the finishing touches on his 1957 book that provided an operant account of communication and language. She was at Harvard for only one term and later spoke about her experiences there in an address to the APA. She completed her doctoral degree back in Minnesota in 1958, and following graduate school, she learned that landing a job in academia was no small feat for a woman at that time. She was told by the institution that granted her degree that they would not be ready to hire women as faculty for a few more years, and she found it absolutely perplexing that an institution would train a person for a job in academia whom they would not be willing to hire. Nevertheless, Siegel published more than 30 papers over the following decade, and most of these were related to behavioral induction, including schedule-induced behavior like polydipsia, which refers to a period of excessive drinking beyond what could be accounted for by other factors. In 1960, she began her time as an assistant professor at San Diego State College. And 7 years later, she moved to North Carolina to serve as director of the Institute of Child and Family Development at UNCG. This work seemed to have reignited her interest in verbal behavior. And while she was there, she published her most cited work, and many people would say her most important work, Induction and the Provenance of Operants. This paper was the culmination of her work in schedule-induced behavior, and it continues to influence behavior theory and philosophy today. In 1973, she returned to San Diego, where she established and led a primate laboratory. And she published another important paper in 1977 in which she sought to reconcile the linguistic theories of Skinner and Chomsky, and this is something that neither of those men would have been interested in from her accounts. In her 1982 address at APA, Siegel took the opportunity to share her experiences as a student and professional. She did not shy away from describing some of the hardships that she encountered along the way. She acknowledged that this was quite unusual for an address at a scientific meeting, and what she shared provided important context for the experience of women and queer people. Notably, she spoke about that semester at Harvard. She described her joy with working in the lab and learning from Skinner and Charlie Furster. And she also spoke of the tragic series of events that led to her expulsion. This began when she was raped by another student from the lab. As she struggled to recover, she saw a psychiatrist and shared with him that she was gay and spoke of the challenges that came along with this. He then urged the dean to expel her. Skinner pushed back, but was unsuccessful in keeping her as a student. In her sharing of these facts, there was no bitterness, only a hope that her audience would not let something like this happen at their university. She said in her speech that although nature and data are impersonal, science is neither impersonal nor is it value-free. She argued that we should incorporate our humanity in all of our scientific activities. Her warm relationship with Skinner continued, and in 1987 they produced a video interview, and this is available on YouTube. My arrows aren't working. There we go. Okay. Here are some excerpts from the 1982 address. Eve Siegel gave a great gift to the field of behavior analysis and to those of us who see ourselves reflected in her experience and values. We're lucky that she gave us a chance to know her, even if just a little bit. And here are some selected quotes from those who knew Eve and her work. Eve Siegel's efforts did not stop with research and writing. She lived her values with the goal of effecting change. Over the years, she was engaged in activism and advocacy in favor of nuclear disarmament, women and queer people, people who worked in academia, people suffering from chronic illness, and the humane treatment of animals. Toward the end of the 1980s, she shifted her attention to the visual fine arts, and I was fortunate to find some of her work on Flickr. She had set up an account in 2015, and pictured here are some of her pieces. Please join me in celebrating the life and work of Eve Siegel.
Our fourth inductee is Dr. Judith Albert Fable. Judy is able to be here with us today, so she will hear us celebrate her accomplishments and her accolades. She has published over 100 different products, including books. She is a fellow in 5 different professional organizations. I am a fellow in one, and I can't even see the second one coming. She has been the president of virtually every professional organization that has created the foundation of what we do, including the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and she has served as president of the BACB. She was the co-editor of a journal. She served as the CEO of AdvoServe. She provided expert testimony in multiple cases critical to disability rights, using her eloquence to convey the importance of the right to effective treatment to those who are making laws that might limit or enable access to meaningful services. And she has played a tremendous role as a mentor and role model for women in our profession. These are just a selection of some of the awards she has received, including the Sidman Award. She was an author for the 2018 JABA Seminal Article Award, The Right to Effective Behavioral Treatment. She has received the Jerry Shook Award for contributions to the practice of behavior analysis. She has been identified as a distinguished alumnus from both her undergraduate and graduate programs. She also received the North Carolina Association for Behavior Analysis Award for Excellence, and those who know her know that she is a true force of nature. This timeline illustrates what she was able to accomplish in her career. Please come to the reception to explore in more detail these periods when she received her PhD in 1970 from the University of Kansas, served as a clinical director and research psychologist at the Western Carolina Center, served as co-editor of Analysis and Intervention in Developmental Disabilities, served as a clinical director and subsequently CEO of AdvoServe, president at ABAI, president of the Florida Association of Behavior Analysis, president of APA Division 33. She was also a founding board member of the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts at the same time as she was the president of the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. So when you think about the effort and the energy that goes into one of these positions, imagine if you ran them all at once. One of the things that I think it's critical to mention is that we are fortunate to have a community of women who are here supporting each other. But there was a time when there was a single solitary event on the ABAI calendar, and that was Women Behaving Boldly. This was a panel discussion of some of the women leaders in our field. And they would get in a room with people like you and me and offer some words and strategies for success for professional women. That was a distant forerunner to what we are able to enjoy today. These different articles represent some of the unique contributions that Dr. Fable has had, not only in being a leader in our field, but in sharing strategies and wisdom with other people in hopes that they will readily be able to step into her shoes. They are big shoes to fill. This series of selected publications includes some of my favorite works. Please come and explore them more. I want to point out that Dr. Fable is the first person in our timeline who has a family. 2 daughters, 2 grandsons, 1 granddog, and maybe soon a puppy. These women had a distinct challenge in being able to be a professional and also have marriages, children, and the family life that many of us desire and are able to enjoy. It was a different time, it was a different generation, and Judy was one of the first of this generation to do both and to succeed. If you have had even one interaction with Judy during this conference, or even seen her from afar, you probably saw her smile, heard her laughter, her warmth, and she was eager to meet you. Many people who have known her had positive things to say about her. Jim Carr mentions that as the president of the BACB, she led the organization through a particularly tumultuous time. Judy Fable is hands down the most effective behavior analyst I know. Her intellect, strategic thinking, political savvy, and personal skills are awe-inspiring. Judy has accomplished many amazing feats while dealing with broken glass from many ceilings. We have all benefited from the force of nature that is Judy Fable. Bridget Taylor, a subsequent president of the BACB, mentions that she first saw Judy speak at ABAI 25 years ago. We all sat enwrapped as she shared her vision of behavior analysis as a transformative force for good in the lives of real people. In the years since, I've repeatedly turned to her wisdom and inspiration in fulfilling the mission that Judy describes as having learned from her mentor: do good and take data. They say true brilliance is harnessing your own knowledge for the benefit of those around you. Our field, our practitioners, and the human lives that we touch have all benefited immeasurably from the radiance of Judy's brilliance. This is from Mike Cataldo, who went to graduate school with Judy. He says, when I met Judy, I thought, what an interesting person. She was engaging, disarming, and magical. I paid attention and observed whenever I could, and I watched her bring about major needed changes and advances in several fields, always inspiring others to follow her example. People do great things, but not in such an engaging, disarming, and seemingly magical way. Doing things with Judy was not only important, but great fun, not at all like work. More like an outing at a theme or amusement park with someone who knows all the best rides. We are judged by the difference that we make in people's lives, and by this standard, Judy has acquitted herself quite well. For many clients, colleagues, and friends, she has often accomplished the seemingly impossible. The first to reach out to someone in trouble, pick up the person who had stumbled, recognize a colleague that was about to be forgotten. If I were to choose one trait to emphasize above all others, it would be courage. Because while these other traits are necessary, the most difficult, important part of making dreams come true is the first step, the courage to try. That is what I admire and value most about Judy. Ed Morris said it much more succinctly. Smart, positive, charming. She was a leader, but without people knowing they were being led. I was in awe. And finally, Jane Howard, yet another female president of the BACB, says we are a lucky bunch because we have Judy in all her glory, the behavior analyst par excellence, the leader, the iconoclast. Judy's gifts include her writings, her work in public policy, and professional leadership. Judy has an amazing ability to provide hard truths in a way that makes the listener understand that she is genuinely on their side. She is hilarious and kind, and she is the person I most want in the foxhole with me. I am deeply grateful and honored to have the opportunity to present Dr. Judy Fable as an inductee in the Women in Behavior Analysis Hall of Fame.
This is me speechless. Somebody should get this. No, don't you dare get this picture. I am truly beyond gratitude for this. I'll try to recover, but I have to tell you that this is one of the most meaningful and important things that's ever happened to me in my career or my life. This has truly been a highlight for me. And I thank Linda and Chada and Carol and Devin and Denise for this honor, but for you, my community of colleagues and friends. We are in this together, and I thank you so much for this tribute. Linda seems to know more about me than I remember, or that I care to admit. She doesn't know it all, but she knows a lot. And across these roles, these facets, these eras, across my life and my career, there has been one constant. I am a woman. And that has remained my central focus. It's the lens through which I view the world, its triumphs, its troubles. Now, it's not the only focus. We as a gender are legendary multitaskers, but it has been indeed a common thread and theme across my life and in everything I've done. So today, I simply want to remind myself and each of you to maintain that perspective as a woman, to remember who we are and then to behave accordingly, with dignity, with pride, and with rock-solid determination and resolve, knowing that our behavior is not ours alone. It reflects the behavior and the attributes of all women. So the message is simple today: to be proud, to nurture your strengths, proud as a behavior analyst and as a woman. It was mentioned, Linda mentioned about my mentor, Todd Risley, who said, everything we do is toward one goal, and that is to make a meaningful difference. And that is what we are all about, meaningful differences in the lives of individuals and to humanity. But Todd also gave us, I hope we catch on camera the fact that my nose is running. Todd also gave us his 4-word formula for how to make a meaningful difference, and that is do good and take data. Thank you.
So this is just the first of what we hope will be an annual tradition of celebrating those who laid the foundation, those who created the opportunity for us to have this experience. Bea Barrett, Martha Banal, Eve Siegel, and Judy Fable, but they will be followed by many more. Please do join us for the Hall of Fame reception at the Parthenon tonight, 8 to 10 p.m. There's a good chance Judy will give you a hug. Thank you, everyone. And now I think we'll have the networking sessions. Is that right?